don't worry, we're still waiting for people coming in, right, so we're fine. This hush is wonderful, actually. I think we can begin. So you're all most welcome to this event this evening. I'm Janice Kay, I'm the University Provost. I'm really delighted to welcome you so many here this evening. I must tell you that this event was fully booked in less than 6 hours. And I suspect we could have filled this auditorium 10 times over. And we're also live streaming the event. So a warm welcome to those of you who are joining us online. So tonight, we're honoured to be joined by radio broadcaster and author Simon Mayo in conversation with Professor Mark Kermode, film critic and honorary professor here at Exeter. If you've ever heard their joint film review programme on BBC Radio 5 Live, you'll know what a treat we're in for this evening, and I do hope we'll witness wit-attainment in action. Now, Simon Mayo is one of Britain's best-loved and well-known presenters. He's worked on BBC Radio since 1981 and has presented BBC Radio 2's Drive Time for 8 years. He accompanies us on our journeys home at the end of the day. He is a friend to the nation as we transition from work to home, and of course has alleviated the boredom of many a taxi service. His list of accolades reflects his tremendous service to broadcasting, including being awarded Radio Broadcaster of the Year by the Broadcasting Press Guild and Speech Broadcaster of the Year by the Sony Radio Academy. Alongside his broadcasting career, Simon is a highly successful novelist, having written 4 books for young people set in Cornwall and released his first novel for adults, Mad Blood Rising, earlier this year. As many of you will already know, this historical novel, set not far from here in Dartmoor Prison, is inspired by true events, and there are plans to adapt Mad Blood Rising for the big screen. Tonight, Simon will generously share some of his insights and experiences as a novelist and discuss his career as an author and as a broadcaster. So this event is part of the Creative Dialogue series developed by film producer and honorary professor Don Boyd and Professor of Film Will Higby. You'll hear from Will later. The series brings high-profile people from the creative arts and media to Exeter to inspire our students, staff and alumni, and to share these experiences with the wider Exeter community and, of course, the South West. The Creative Dialogue series builds on Exeter's proud history of arts and culture, which is recognised internationally. We're extremely proud to host the Bill Douglas Cinema Museum and the Northcote Theatre on our campus and to partner with the London Film School. Our English department is in the world's top 50, and we're leaders in the areas of film studies, drama and creative writing. Leading the conversation this evening is Mark Kermode, Chief Film Critic for The Observer, and as I say, our own newly appointed Honorary Professor of Film. Mark, who holds a PhD from the University of Manchester, quite sure why it's not in Exeter, but there we go. He's written and presented film and music shows on Channel 4 and across BBC Radio and Television, including his acclaimed BBC series from earlier this year, Mark Kermode's Secrets of Cinema. He holds 2 Sony Awards for his radio programmes and is also no stranger for publishing, with a list of books to his name, most recently his memoir, How Does It Feel? A Life of Musical Misadventures. As if this weren't enough, he plays double bass and harmonica, recording and performing live with the skiffle and blues band, the Dodge Brothers. Together, Simon Mayo and Mark Kermode make a formidable team. Their joint film review programme on BBC Radio 5 Live, the BBC's flagship film programme, is a raging success. It's one of the BBC's most downloaded podcasts and has won the British Podcast Awards Listener's Choice Award for the last 2 years. Their programme is characterised by sharp and witty banter, which I'm sure we'll see in evidence this evening. As the evening unfolds, there'll be an opportunity for you in the audience to ask questions too. So I won't keep us waiting any longer. Just a reminder, of course, that the Cinema Code of Conduct applies. Simon, Mark, it's over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for that. You can all hear us, can't you? Great. So the way this will work is
If they can't hear us.
Yeah. I know. I understand.
What about in the very back row?
See, this is the problem. He's a presenter, I'm a contributor. Now we've changed the roles round, he's going to get chippy, OK? So the way it's going to work this time, Simon, is that I'm going to ask you the questions, OK? And then I'm going to do the thing that you do, which is while you're answering, I'm going to fiddle with my phone, OK? And I'm going to see how you like it. So we'll talk for about sort of 35 minutes, something like that, about Simon's book, which I think many of you will have read. This is a copy of it, Mad Blood Stirring, which is out now and is getting fantastic reviews. And then there will be some time for questions at the end of it. So, Simon, let's start with this. The inspiration for Mad Blood Stirring came about when you were researching the previous book. So tell us how it happened.
Yeah. So, first of all, thank you for inviting me down. Mad Blood Stirring came about by accident, really. Like most things, I just sort of stumbled into it. My previous book was called Blame, and it's set in prisons in London, set a few years in the future. But I needed a prison in the southwest of England to conclude it because that was going to be the finale. That's where it needed to be set. So I obviously thought, well, Dartmoor Prison is probably the most famous prison in the southwest of England. I'll set it there. So started to research Dartmoor Prison, then sort of stumbled into some of this story and thought that's too interesting to waste as a venue for the conclusion of the book. So I diverted my heroes out of this part into Bodmin, and so it finishes in a revamped Bodmin prison, which is a horrendous kind of Madame Tussauds at the moment. But anyway, in my book, it's kind of a fully active prison again. So then having got a flavour for what happened at Dartmoor, I went back and researched, because I'm a His-Pol graduate, basically, so I quite like the researchy bit.
Yes.
So disappeared into the research and was amazed by what I found, really, because Dartmoor Prison, as many of you will know, still looks pretty much like it did when it was built in 1807. It's built for prisoners of the Napoleonic War. But as it emptied of prisoners, the French soldiers, it filled up with American sailors. Because Britain at the time was fighting this war, which has become known helpfully as the War of 1812. So it's easy to remember when it was. And because most of the battles were fought at sea, they were sailors. So there are 7... I realise this is a long answer to your question.
No,
I'm reading all this stuff for the first time and thinking this is amazing. So the accommodation is in 7 blocks. They're arranged in a semicircle. Each block holds 1,000 prisoners. At the request of the white American, so 7,000 sailors. Horrendous, overcrowding, disease, a terrible place. At the request of the white American sailors, the prisons are segregated. It's the only time in this country there's been a racially segregated prison. And prison 4 becomes the non-white block where the black prisoners go. Prison 4 is run by one guy. This is all the stuff that I'm reading, thinking, I never knew that. Poldark is on the TV. It's a few years earlier and it's down the road, but it's that period. This doesn't feel like the same England. Prison 4 is run by one man, a prisoner from Maryland. He's 6'7", or 7 foot, depending on, or 6'4", depending on which account you want. Anyway, he's big. He calls himself King Dick, and he runs the gambling, and he is a theatrical impresario. So I'm going, this is really? He goes everywhere with a club in one hand. He has a bearskin hat on his head. He's followed everywhere by 2 white boys. So this guy is becoming larger and larger by the moment. And in 1814, he puts on Othello and Romeo and Juliet in Dartmoor Prison. And I get to the Romeo and Juliet bit, and I think, that's a story. That's got to be a story, hasn't it? So I think it's the first black production of Shakespeare in Britain. I think it's the first time gospel music, or as it is still correctly called, Negro spirituals, are performed in this country. So I thought this has got to be a moment. I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I thought that sounds like a good setting for a story.
But your very first response was, everyone must know about this, I must be the only person who doesn't. And what you then did was you contacted people who you thought must have heard about it.
Well, this is about 3 or 4 years ago, I guess now. There was a series on Radio 4 which Lenny Henry was presenting about black theatre in Britain. And I know Lenny a bit. Our paths cross occasionally. We have the same management company. And I arranged to meet him. And I said to Lenny, because now he has this extraordinary career, he's a fantastic Shakespearean actor. Lenny, if anyone's going to know about it, do you know this story of the segregated prisons in Dartmoor? Do you know about King Dick? Do you know about Othello, Romeo and Juliet? And this is very reassuring. He'd never heard of the story, genuinely didn't know the story, was enthused by the story, wanted to direct the film of the story, but it was fantastic because there is a freelance paranoia, there's certainly an author's paranoia that you have a good idea and you're thinking, someone else must have had this idea first. And so you have a scan through the internet to see if anyone else has told the story. So I Googled King Dick, which I actually have to say was a mistake. You don't really do quite a narrow search to focus it down. But the intriguing thing is, and maybe we've been looking the way and we haven't wanted to write this story, but King Dick has been in 5 other novels, he's been in a film, and he's been in a play. But so he's become like a mythical character in America. Although actually in America, a lot of people don't know about him there, but there was a film in 1952, a film called Lydia Bailey. It's based on a book called Lydia Bailey, and in that film, King Dick is played by William Marshall, and he's played as a revolutionary from Haiti. And he's this elegant gentleman who has 8 children and 8 wives and a courtyard full of children. And this is King Dick. But King Dick probably went to Haiti, but he's been sort of turned into this mythical figure. Anyway, so there was enough in there for me to check the facts, to check with people like Lenny. And I spoke to Amara Santi, our friend who's the film director, and she didn't know the story either. So I was sufficiently encouraged to think, well, here's the story. You might as well do it before someone else does.
When you had reached that point, I mean, I remember you and I had a phone conversation because you said, I've stumbled on this thing and I think it's really something. And I said, OK, give me the short version. And you gave me the short version. And I felt the same as everybody else, which was that it's astonishing that no one else knows this. You then proceeded to write a treatment for it. And there was a point, because your previous novels had been what's now categorized as YA novels, like the Itch novels, all that stuff, YA novels. And there must have been a point at which you wondered whether or not to continue doing it. Did you always think of this as an adult novel, or because it's having read it and having also read the Itch books, there's not a huge difference in tone, is there?
No. So children's YA adult are kind of obviously made up for book buyers to help people buy books, but also it's the way the publishing industry is orientated. And basically, a YA book is really a book with teenagers in as the main characters. That's really the only thing that makes it YA. The problem with that, fairly obviously, is that Romeo and Juliet would then become, that's a YA play. So you go, well, does that work? I'm not really quite sure. There are 3 main characters in Mad Blood Stirring. King Dick is one. The other 2, so he's real, and the other 2 are 2 characters I made up. Joe Hill, who is 16, and Habakkuk Snow, who is 17. So the 2 other characters are teenagers. So there was a push from Penguin Random House to make it a YA book, but it just didn't feel like a YA book to me. And I think the reason for that is that Joe and Habakkuk, who's known as Habs in the book, they're on the same side. They're both American sailors, but in 1814, 1815, they didn't really have teenagers. You were either a boy or you're a man, you're a girl or you're a woman. These people have been killing or trying to kill the British for the last couple of years. It just didn't feel like a teenage story. So, but you can read, it absolutely could. I mean, I love YA, so there are some of the best fiction out there is YA. So it wouldn't have mattered, I don't think, but it felt always to me more of an adult book rather than a YA book.
The book also occupies this weird kind of intake of breath space because it begins with the knowledge that the war is over, and yet we're now in this kind of anticipatory period of how it's all going to play out. Is that actually when the Romeo and Juliet production happened?
Yes. So briefly, if we did I mean, I know I'm at a university and one of Britain's finest universities, and my current favourite.
The film department's particularly ace.
So I hear. And though the English department very strong.
Very strong, very strong. Very hard to get into.
Very hard.
Very hard to get into.
I hear the student intake this year is particularly good.
Particularly good, yeah. With straight A's all the way through.
So the War of 1812, if I asked you honestly, what do you know about the War of 1812, the chances are that most people wouldn't really know much about the War of 1812. It's such an obscure topic that In Our Time on Radio 4 had it as one of its topics, that Melvyn Bragg introduced a conversation about the War of 1812, and obviously most of those topics are completely baffling. But so it's there, and it's a kind of an obscure war, really. So I'm answering your question. So what happened is the War of 1812 finishes on Christmas Eve, 1814, but the peace says ratified by the British, and the peace treaty has to go to the United States. That obviously takes a long time. So the process of ratification, it has to go to Senate in America. The president has to sign it, has to be discussed and approved, then it has to come back. That process takes 4 or 5 months. And in that period, all these 7,000 prisoners know that the war is over. They are prisoners of war, but there's no war. So everything deteriorates pretty quickly in Dartmoor, a horrendous place anyway, as I've mentioned. But when there isn't a war, they just want to be let out, understandably. The British say, but if we let you out, we have to work out where you're going to go, how you're going to get home. The treaty has to be ratified, and if we let you out, you'll probably just get press-ganged into the British Navy, and you really, really don't want that. And they kind of get that. So that whole period from January through to April is a tempestuous period, and it does end with this is a bit of a spoiler, I suppose, but it does end with the Dartmoor Massacre, which happens on April the 6th, 1815. And so what I decided to do was to run the tragedy of Romeo and Juliet into the tragedy of the Dartmoor Massacre. So that's my artistic license. So I have shifted it by a few months because I thought they would work quite well together. And I mean, Mad Blood Stirring is a quote from Romeo and Juliet, and there are kind of echoes of Romeo and Juliet throughout the book, so that Will and Habs, Joe and Habs are the Romeo and Juliet characters, and there's also, as we're in a university, there's a Tybalt and there's a Mercutio and there's a Benvolio as well, who they kind of represent their figures in the play. And
the 5-act structure and the way in which the story plays out mirrors all the way through.
Well, that was sort of too much to resist. So Romeo and Juliet, told in 5 acts, happens over 4.5 days. I also tell in 5 acts, and it happens over like 4.5 months. And there's a little kind of playlet scene at the end of each act.
So you wrote a treatment of the story.
Oh, yeah.
And which I presume that you wrote for your own purposes in constructing the shape of the book. But the next thing that happened was that I had a conversation with you in which you said, "Oh, there's a possibility of a film adaptation," and I said, "But you haven't written the book." Yeah. And you went, "I know, but I wrote a treatment." So what? How did this? This is crazy.
Are they Minions socks you're wearing?
They are. Yeah. I wore these when I did the onstage with Spike Lee, so if it's good enough for Spike Lee, it's good enough for you. Yes, I'm wearing them. I like Minions, and I'm not going to be embarrassed about it.
So it was quite.
You appear to have stepped in 2 Cornish pasties, but I'm not mentioning your,
What was the question again?
The question was, you were writing the book at the same time that a potential film adaptation was afoot.
Yeah, I mean, I suspect this will never happen again, but yeah, so what happened was I talked this through with my literary agent, and he said, write a 4-page treatment. And I'd never written a treatment before. So that weekend, I wrote pretty much what turned out to be the book. I wrote it in the 5 acts, what happens at the end, finishing with the massacre, introduction of King Dick and everything, and all the things that happened. And I put it down in 4 pages. And on the basis of the 4 pages, there was a lot of interest, and the film rights were sold then. So you're absolutely right. So the producers were waiting for me to finish before I'd even started, which is not the most kind of relaxing situation. But they were very good, and we had a rough time scale, and I was only a little bit late in delivering. But it did mean that there were a couple of moments in the writing of the book where I allowed myself to think, if it does make it into a screenplay and a film, I bet that bit stays in.
Yeah.
But essentially, it's quite theatrical because it's set in one place. I mean, it is just set within the 7 blocks of Dartmoor Prison, apart from one scene where they go out. So yes, the film rights went very early, and yes, that is a bizarre place to be.
Because Jack Thorne started writing the screenplay before you'd finished writing the novel.
Well, he'd been signed up. He knew he basically bought it on the idea of the 4 pages.
Yeah.
Because he could see that it was a very interesting story.
And Jack Thorne is a very famous screenwriter.
Yeah. So Jack has been. He wrote the Harry Potter play, Harry Potter and the Cursed Child. He's actually on Broadway at the moment. He's just written King Kong. He's been signed up for the new Star Wars film. And the His Dark Materials trilogy, Philip Pullman, is being adapted for BBC television, all 3 books, and Jack's the guy that's done it. So I was thinking, well, if it's good enough for JK and Star Wars, well, that came afterwards, and Philip Pullman, then I think that's fine with me.
Yeah. Was it in any way worrying? I mean, deadlines are, I know you are brilliant about the way you write. You get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and you do it like, you go into you have a writer's retreat,
shed.
A writer's shed.
It's like David Cameron, yeah.
Yeah. And is that what he has?
He's got like a Ponzi caravan, yeah.
Okay, because you get up first thing in the morning, because there'd be times that we'd speak at 8 o'clock in the morning and you'd been working for 3 hours.
Yeah, I mean, that's the theory. It sometimes happens like that, yes.
Okay.
Last year has been a bit distracting. I've had other things on my mind, but essentially, yes.
Okay, and what about, the most difficult thing about it is getting the voices of the characters right, because by your own admission, these are not voices with which you'd be familiar. When reading your previous books, I mean, particularly with the Itch series, there are times in it that I can hear your voice speaking those characters, but that's completely different with Mad Blood Stirring. You're in a whole different register.
Yeah.
So how did you approach that?
Well, you're right. I mean, it's probably the thing I sweated over the most is to come up with dialogue where you, the reader, would enter into it and get lost in the spirit of the story, and not think at any stage that anything was clunky or inappropriate or off-putting. So the people that are in this book are all sailors from 1814, 1815. There are soldiers, English soldiers. There's the agent, who's the governor of the prison, and his wife. They're the people that populate this story. The English soldiers, okay, I'm pretty much there. The English agent and his wife, okay, I'm sort of there. The American sailors, something else altogether. And in the book, we spend a lot of time in prison 4, which is the Black Prison. So the challenge really was to come up with dialogue which feels believable and feels appropriate. The key thing that I had to remember was they didn't all speak the same way. So we have in prison 4 escaped slaves. We have free men who've been free for many generations. We have men originally from the west coast of Africa, men from the Caribbean, men who've been living in the United States for many years, men from India. So they didn't all speak in the same way. But equally, I didn't want to write a book that felt like it was in a heavy patois, which was quite difficult to read. And I spent a lot of time listening to some recordings in the Library of Congress from the United States, listening to the oldest recordings I could find of slaves. Essentially, they were 40 or 50 years on. Just to get some kind of resonance, some kind of temper, some kind of feeling for the way they might have spoken in 1814. The other thing that they had in common was that they were men of the sea. And as we know, the language of the sea populates a lot of, is part of the way we speak now. The other thing that is in this book is the language of Shakespeare, because King Dick, I've told you about this extraordinary 6'7" guy, the hat, the club, everything else, and he's a Shakespeare scholar. I mean, he is an enthusiast of Shakespeare. How can you make that believable? So I wanted to come up with dialogue which was honest and as true as I could make it. And whether it works or not is entirely up to the reader to discuss. And the book comes out in America in January, so I shall find out quite how successful it's been as far as they're concerned.
When it was first published, you said that somebody wrote you a letter and they said, on page 300 and blah-de-blah, you've referred to a weapon that was 5 years out. And you said you heaved a sigh of relief because you thought, OK, if that's the detail that I've got wrong, I can live with it. But there must have been a real...
I think I put rifle instead of musket.
Fine. But there must have been a sense, because you're dealing with, historical fact, because you know that it's going to be read by people who've actually kind of lived in that area, there must have been a huge sense of relief that you do appear to have got the history straight. Because no matter how much research you do, no matter how much checking, the worry is always that you're going to do something, that the minute somebody who actually knows the territory really well, they're going to go, that's not right.
Oh, yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true, and I shall be nervous in January again, when it comes out in America, obviously. But and I did wonder about, who should tell this story? Who has the right to tell this story? And then I thought, well, you have the right to tell this story. This is a uniquely Anglo-American story. I read more for this book, more background than anything I've ever read before. There's a helpful bibliography at the back of the book. But David Olusoga, in his last book, the British Nigerian historian, he says black history is everyone's history. And it was a very interesting phrase because I thought in this story it feels true. This is an interesting moment in history. And I went to Dartmoor Prison about 6 weeks ago and spoke to the prisoners there, which was a very surreal experience, being in their library and talking to them about Dartmoor Prison. And some of them had read the book whilst being in Dartmoor Prison, obviously. And Prison 4 is a dilapidated, sort of unused building, painted black creosote. And we kind of peered inside. And the Stranglers played there in 1991, apparently, and there's still Stranglers graffiti on the side. So it's not quite the Prison 4 that I remember, but it really was quite a moment because I just stood there and thought, wow, this is the building where it all happened. And I would like to think at some stage in the future, I mean, who knows what's going to happen to Dartmoor Prison, because it looks antiquated, that it should be marked in some way. It feels to me like a historical site. It feels as though the fact that this is the first black Shakespeare, the fact that this is the first time we had gospel music, just is I know people can't go in and see it because it's still a working prison, but it just feels like it's an important story that should be told. In fact, Anita Anand and William Dalrymple did an event, and I was talking to them, and I admire William Dalrymple as a writer and historian amazingly, because he writes huge fat books, and it's pioneering history that he writes. And he said, why didn't you write it as a non-fiction book? And I think the main reason for that is it's easier to tell as a novel. I think you can get to the heart of this story easier as a novel. And also a lot of the original documents were lost in a fire in Dartmoor. So I hope I've done the story justice, but obviously others will decide that.
One of the things about it being adapted for a screenplay is, having read the book, I couldn't imagine...
Thank you, by the way, for reading my book.
Yeah, I mean, I know I've lied to you in the past about reading others of your books, but I have actually read Mad Blood Stirring.
I've read all your books.
Yeah, I don't believe you. I read it thinking, because even the audiobook comes in at something like 13 hours, right?
Yeah.
And to get it down to a 2-hour movie script, I had a conversation with you just the other day, and I said, you know, have you lost anything major? And there's a whole character who
may or may not. I mean, here's the thing: it's a 13-hour story. If you get a copy of this today and you read it non-stop, it'll take you about 13 hours. Or you can listen to the audiobook. That's how long it takes. The screenplay is, as Mark says, about 2 hours 20 minutes. So it's an act of miniaturization. That's what it is.
Yeah.
And Jack's done an amazing job. But in the process of that, you lose a lot of stuff. And so the author of the book is going, you can't lose that. You can't. What? This is, you know, he's done a fantastic job. And of course, I'm going, oh, what? But anyway, but it's a thing, you know, it's a thing of beauty. So I'm very happy and thrilled that he's doing it. And there'll be many discussions, I'm sure, in the future as to how it progresses.
But did you decide, okay, I'm just going to step away from it, that I'm not going to get my hands in, you know, did you just...
Well, I mean, essentially, it won't be up to me. Essentially, what you do is you kind of sign it away. But I'm working with producers who want me to be involved in the process. So, for example, Itch, which is the first book I wrote, which is this series set in Cornwall, about a 14-year-old boy who's an element hunter, has been bought by it's going to be made as an Australian TV series set in Perth. So they've swapped Cornwall for Perth. With that, I've been sent the scripts to have a look at, but I don't want to read them because I'll just go, oh, you can't, oh, what? You can't.
But you are going to go and spend, you're going to go to the set and...
I'm going to go to Australia and tell them what's what.
Yeah.
Because they really, apparently they warm very much to English people going over and telling them what to do. So I thought I'd do some of that. But with Mad Blood, I feel very passionately about what the heart of the book is. So that if they ask me, I will say, I would really like it to have this. It would be great if it finished like that, or please don't. I don't know what's going to happen. But my plan is to stay involved. Ultimately, it's down to the director, whoever the director is, the producers and the screenwriter. But I feel very passionately that, for example, I mean, the main challenge, it seems to me, for the book and also for the movie, is how to stop King Dick being a cartoon figure. Because when you read about him factually, he is clearly larger than life. He was at least a foot taller than every other sailor in the prison. With the bearskin hat, with the club, he's already extraordinary. Add in the theatre, add in the gambling, add in the white boys that he hangs out with, and you've got someone that you really don't... This is a fragile character that if you go too far one way, people go, this is just preposterous. Or if I didn't want to downplay it either, because he dominated Prison 4. He basically took over Prison 4 within weeks of arriving. So I think that's the challenge. So obviously, who they cast... I mean, I'm talking as though it's actually going to happen, but I'm just saying that the challenge in the book was to make Dick correct.
Well, we had a really cryptic conversation in a pub in which you said that they'd said somebody's name for that role, and then you wouldn't tell us who it was.
No,
and we just spent the next 2 hours taunting you with who it was.
Yes. Well, look, here's the thing. The only thing, so you know that King Dick is 6'7", okay? So that's a challenge straight away. Although, having said that, if anyone has seen the Jack Reacher movies starring Tom Cruise, the only thing we know about Jack Reacher is that he's 6'4". The one thing we know about Tom Cruise is he ain't 6'4", and that's clearly so. Anyway, so who knows? So it could be anyone.
Can I ask you a professional question? You know, you and I do a review show. This is not to do with films, but we do a review show. You've done you now have the books podcast, which came out of something that you started doing on the BBC, and now you've sort of claimed it as your own. So you've been involved. Pardon me?
Don't need them anymore.
No, exactly. But you've been involved in review programmes for quite a long time.
Yeah.
And you've been a champion of literature, but a champion of also talking about literature and being critical about literature. When the book came out, did you think about reviews? Did you worry about them, and did you read them?
I don't think that there is an author anywhere that isn't petrified of reviews. I mean, maybe when you get to J.K. Rowling level, you genuinely don't care and don't need to care because you're J.K. Rowling.
Okay.
But I was more nervous for this than anything else, because what if I've got it wrong? You know, what if tonally there was something that was horrendous? You know, what if the language I've used, because there's some very strong racial language in here, what if everyone was very upset by that? So there were long editorial conversations about getting that right. So I hope I got it right, but obviously if your reviewer says you got it wrong, then that's bad.
I think you did get it right. I mean, I think you've done it brilliantly. I can't quite believe that it happened in the period of time that it did happen, because I remember the beginning of the book and I remember the end. I can't quite believe that you managed to get that much stuff done in that period of time. But then, what was the first review you read?
Good question. I think it might have been the Times.
And
I think
good or bad?
Yeah, it was. They were all good. I think the Guardian was a bit sniffy. Who cares? You know, the Observer. I mean, yeah. No. In general, the reviews were, they were pretty good. But as I said, I'll get nervous again in January. I was encouraged by Lee Child, who wrote a quote which is on the book, which I didn't even know Lee Child had been sent the book. So when you read that on a book, because I'm always very impressed if Lee Child likes something. So because he's such an extraordinarily successful author, that if Lee says it's good, then I assume that it's good, because he doesn't need to say. But yes, of course, yes, of course, really, really nervous about anybody saying anything. But I think, as you've said many times, critics can be overrated, you know. I mean,
and wrong,
and wrong, and who knows what their agenda is anyway? And did they actually read all of it all the way through? So I don't think they have the power that they used to have. And I think with social media, and you do have the power to get the message out and speak directly to authors. I mean, I would have loved growing up to have been able to send a message to my favourite authors and have a chance of them actually replying. And if you follow J.K. Rowling on Twitter, you see that she does that. I mean, obviously she doesn't do it a lot. So I think critics are very important and to be honoured, cherished, and respected, but only so much.
Did you have an audience in mind when you were writing? Because I know we talked about this before. As far as Itch was concerned, I think you did have a kind of, you had an idea of who you were writing it for, who you were writing it to. But did you have that same thing with Mad? Because Mad Blood Stirring and this is not in any way to diminish the achievements of the previous books, but this is a whole different league in terms of the scope of it.
Well, I think here's the thing. I very early on, I only started writing when I was 50, and very early on, a friend of mine encouraged me to read, as I would encourage, I've encouraged many people to read a book called On Writing by Stephen King, the horror writer. And sometime in the 90s, he was involved in a very nasty accident, nearly killed him. And as part of his recovery process, he wrote On Writing. And it's part memoir, and it's part, this is how I do it. And I found it inspirational because it isn't a how-to manual. It absolutely is not, this is what you do. But when you finish it, if you've got half an idea for a novel or a book of any kind, you will probably think, as you finish this book, I'm going to give it a shot. And one of the things that Stephen King writes about in there, one of the many things, he talks about honest dialogue. People complain to him about language, swearing, profanity, and so on. He says, if you don't believe the dialogue, then no one's going to read it, which is one of the reasons I went with the language that I went with in the book. But he also says that there's no right way to write a novel. But one of the things he says is, have an ideal reader. This is the answer to your question. Have an ideal reader in mind. Who are you writing it for? And I was aware that this is a very blokey book because it's a male prison. So it's quite difficult to have lots of female characters. There are women in it. There are some women, because they're prisoners of war, there's a daily market which happens. So there are women who run the stalls. There's also Elizabeth Shortland, who's the wife of the agent. But I didn't want to write a grim book. I had no desire to write a prison memoir, which was just grim and bleak as Dartmoor Prison was. So that's why I ended up with the Romeo and Juliet structure, which is light at the beginning and then pretty out of control towards the end. What was the question? Why am I saying this?
Because I said I think that when you were writing Itch, you did have a specific.
That's right. The ideal reader. Anyway, the ideal reader was my wife, because what I wanted to do was to write a book. I know you're saying, oh, cheesy. I can see that. Oh, how. But so what I wanted to do was I wanted to write a book about 7,000 men in prison, which ends with a riot and a massacre, but still to be emotionally engaging, and that's what I did. So that's what I attempted to do.
And when you're doing that, do you think? Having
said that, no one gets to the end of Shawshank Redemption and thinks there really weren't enough women in there. You know, I mean that's not the issue. So it absolutely doesn't need to it needed to be a believable story. But anyway, yes. It
is interesting that you are fascinated by prisons because, blame, the whole idea of blame. And Shawshank is one of your favourite movies, and that whole joke you always had about there's an awful lot of Shawshank before the redemption. But yes. You are...
I don't know why, but it has ended up writing... I do write a lot about...
You are drawn towards incarceration.
That's an ominous sentence.
But it's true though, isn't it? Because you are, I think actually in general, you are a very positive person, you have a very positive, but you are drawn to those stories.
Well, but I've stumbled, I think I've stumbled upon, Blame was set in an imagined future horrific prison, which is like an amalgam of Holloway Prison and Pentonville Prison in London. And that came out of a dream that I had. And then ended up in Bodmin, and then But
the premise of Blame is that you inherit the guilt of...
Yeah, the central idea behind Blame was that you are... future governments suggest that we are criminally responsible for the crimes of our parents. So if your parents committed a crime and they didn't take any punishment for that, then we are entitled. So sins of the fathers, essentially. So that was the idea. And the American justice system isn't too far away from that at the moment. So, yeah, I don't know why that is. Maybe it's because we live near Holloway and Pentonville Prison. I don't know. But yes, I have written too much about prisons. And my new book, I'm not going to write anything about prisons at all. I say that now, but who knows?
What are you going to do after this? Will this now take up your time for the next year or so in terms of promotion? Or is there something else?
I am writing a new novel at the moment, yes.
Can you tell us anything about it?
Not really, no.
Is it set in a prison?
It's not.
Is there a character in it that's a thinly veiled cipher for me?
No, but there is in my second book.
I know.
Good. So in It Rocks, there is a Mark Kermode kind of character.
Yeah, I'm not in that.
No, you don't want to be in this. Really, there aren't many characters to aspire to in Mad Blood.
Okay, but so you are now in the process of writing something else?
Yeah.
And it will take 18 months, 2 years?
Forever. Well, it's already got a release date of April 2020, which I think is quite optimistic,
okay,
to be honest.
Because this is one of the things why when all the stuff about Radio 2 happened, because the reason is because now you've got the Transworld deal that you have you are now on a bit of a sort of treadmill in terms of turning the books round super fast.
Well, super fast for me is like 18 months.
Yeah, that is super fast for writing a novel.
Yeah, but that's not really very fast at all.
Okay.
And not fast enough. So.
All right, so the thing I'm circling round is, are you going to leave me on the radio show, or are you going to... I think the writing's great, and I'm really glad it's taking off, but can you just reassure me that...
So, time for questions. I have no intention of not doing the film show, if that's what you're asking.
But what are you going to do with the film show when the film of Mad Blood Stirring comes out and we have to review it?
I have thought about this a lot. So here's what's going to happen. If and when it comes out, I will recuse myself from hosting the show for this 10-minute period.
You have actually thought this through, haven't you?
I have. And Sanjeev Bhaskar, or one of my other very able deputies, will take my seat. And I will stand behind Mark as he reviews the film. And depending on what he says, or bring him another cup of coffee. So it will be a must-listen to moment. It's one of the things I shall look forward to the most.
But you have actually thought it through. I know that you're being sort of slightly facetious, but you have seriously thought it through.
As soon as the film producers turned up, I'm thinking, wow, if this ever makes it on, what's Mark going to say? So many people have said to me, what is Mark going to say? And the only answer is he will be honest. And if he doesn't like it, he will say he doesn't like it. He might be all awkward and angsty about it, but if it sucks, he'll say, I'm ever so sorry, Simon, but your film sucks. Won't you?
Yeah, because that's what we have to do. Okay, so it's 1:45, and that does seem like a very good moment to throw it open to the audience. If anyone has any questions, stick your hand up.
What if they don't have any questions?
If they don't have any questions, I'm just going to keep prodding you about whether or not you and I've got another 10 years in us. Because there are people watching, we'll start over there, thank you very much. Because people are watching this streamed as well, if you have a question, wait until we can get the microphone to you. I know that everybody in the room can probably hear you, but just in case people online can hear you. So
I'll just say about Q&A is, first of all, I'll take questions from anybody apart from my son, who's not allowed to ask a question. Secondly, that when you do Q&A at schools, which is fantastic, they all put their hands up, and all the questions are, how old are you? And how much money do you earn? They're the two questions, so I won't answer either of those questions either. Yeah,
okay,
no
so I won't ask you those two then.
Okay.
So, first of all, congratulations on what sounds like a cracking idea, and an idea that I think could have a lot of cultural traction, particularly when it makes it into a film in America. But you said you thought about an ideal reader, and you made the gender point between male and female.
Yes.
Did you have a male?
I think we're in dangerous territory now.
Yeah, okay. But did you have a black reader in mind or a white reader in mind? Because when I look around the room here, I don't see, a single black face. And so a bit of provocation. How are you making sure that these talks and your PR is going to reach the black community? Because, like you said, black history is everyone's history.
Yeah.
And you've got a cracker here, and it's just making sure that the black audiences hear it.
Well, it's a very good question. And I think all I tried to do was to tell a story. I genuinely researched it properly, thought about it, worried about it, dreamt about it, and wrote it. I just wrote it. If you stress too much about all those points that you make, which are very valid points, the story would never get written. I just had to write the story the way I saw the story, so that the story is a coming-of-age story, the story is a romance story, the story is a kind of retelling of Romeo and Juliet. It has a huge kind of climactic ending. I had all these things running in my head all at the same time. If anyone's heard the Johnny Cash Live at Folsom Prison albums, there is a sense of danger in those recordings. If Johnny Cash had said, let's rip the place apart, they would have ripped the place apart. This is a dangerous production of Shakespeare. This is a production of Shakespeare with a drunk audience who would have killed if they got a chance. I had all those things running in my head. I think that was quite enough for me to worry about. So that, yes, I had an ideal reader in mind, because I was aware that it was a very male-centered book. But beyond that, I just wanted to tell a story as honestly as I possibly could. And that's...
So I understand that, but I guess the question now is in promoting the book. I understand that in the writing of it, I get that, but it's in the promotion of it with things like creative dialogues, etc., how you reach, the black community.
Well, I go to I'm very fortunate to be invited to events like this and Hay and Cheltenham Festival, and they reach who they reach. And I'll go and speak to anybody about it, and if anyone else wants to book me, I will go and talk to them. So when it comes to reaching audiences, the publishers are kind of in charge of that. I was invited to come and talk here, and I'm very happy to do that. And you're right, it's almost an all-white audience. I didn't invite people to come. You all responded, and so we have the audience that we have. So I don't know what else I can say about that.
Let's take another question. You have to stick your hand up quite far in the air because I might... Yes, there. Thank you. We just run a microphone to you, if that's all right. Thanks.
Hi, Simon.
Hi.
It's obvious that you are a very talented writer. I'm not just saying that, but it is from sort of like listening to you today and also listening to you when you broadcast on the radio. You're very much into literature. Can I ask why you kept it so late until you started writing?
I know, it's annoying for me. Why did I leave it so late? I think there are two answers to that. One is sitting here, because I didn't write anything, because it never occurred to me until my son was 10 years old and he came back from school and he was only interested in science. And I thought I'd write him a short story. I don't know why it occurred to me to write a short story. I'd never written anything before, but I thought I'm going to write a short story about a kid who's obsessed with science. And so that became the Itch book, which came out a couple of years after that, which is about to start filming in Australia. So it had never, I got to the age of 50, it had never occurred to me to write a book. I'd been involved, I'd interviewed hundreds of authors on 5 Live, because we did 2 authors every Thursday, which is pretty much where the Radio 2 Book Club came from. And it genuinely, at no stage had it occurred to me to write a book. And then when the idea came to me, and I discovered this thing that if you collected the periodic table, you were called an element hunter. It was such a brilliant phrase that I thought someone else must have written a story about an element hunter, did the whole frantic search, found that nobody had. So I thought, I'm going to do it then. So I wrote it for Joe, and I printed it. I didn't have a publisher, didn't have a literary agent.
You wrote it completely on spec?
Yeah, I wrote it just completely on spec. Printed it off on my home computer, like 500, just went on and on and on, run out of ink, go and get some more. Handed it to him and said, here you are, this is the thing I've been writing. So, and he said he quite enjoyed it. So then, the publishing thing came after that. But I kind of fell into it.
What year did Itch come out?
I started writing it 8 years ago, and it came out a couple of years after. So it came out about 6 years ago.
So it came out 2012?
Something like that, yeah.
Okay. So obviously by that point, I think my first book had come out maybe 18 months before, and I wonder whether that just helped ease the general...
I said that there were 2 parts to that question. The second part of that question is that I'd been inspired by Mark Kermode and the great standards of... I'm slightly jealous also, and so I thought I want a part of that action.
Because you thought if he can do it, frankly, anyone can do it.
Anybody can. As long as he doesn't write fiction and I don't write movie criticism, we're fine.
Okay, over there. Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
So, with the adaptation of the book to the film, I'm studying adaptation next term, but are you terrified that your vision of the book and everything will be completely misinterpreted? Because or just different? Because the Harry Potter books I love, the Harry Potter films I'm not a fan of. Is that a fear for you, basically?
Thank you for the question. I think, first of all, if it ever becomes a film, that's quite a moment anyway. I have confidence. Of course is the answer. Yes, of course, I lived with this book for 2 or 3 years, and I can visualize Dartmoor Prison, the layout, the characters, the main story, the dialogue in Romeo and Juliet. I had pictures of it stuck all over my walls. I was living it for a long time, and so seeing it, if it does ever become the film, I will. If it's disappointing, I will obviously not say that, because that would not be, but you'll probably be able to tell from my facial expressions, and Mark will know, everyone else will know. But I have confidence that because Jack Thorne is such a great writer, and they won't go with a director who isn't any good. But who knows? Will I like it? I absolutely don't know. If they stay true, to be honest, there isn't much you can do with this. The Dartmoor Massacre happened on April the 6th. And if if it ends with a production of Romeo and Juliet, which then leads to the Dartmoor Massacre, that's kind of the story. And King Dick is going to be in the film. So who knows? I can't think that they will mess it up. But would I be nervous? Absolutely. I'll be, thrilled if it ever makes it that far. But you're right. I mean, any author that gets to that position and sees their characters in human flesh, as it were, I think it would be odd if I wasn't nervous. I mean, I haven't really thought about it too much, but in February when I go to Australia, I'll meet the boy who's playing Itch, and I wrote 3 Itch books, so the idea of actually meeting him for real, which is weird because I thought him up in the first place, that will be strange. I had a conversation with the woman who's in charge of the production in Australia this week, and this is just a sort of a sidebar. Itch is 14 and is a boy, and the main female character is his cousin, who's called Jack, short for Jacqueline, and in the first version of that, they turned Jack into a boy, so it was 2 boys. And at that point, I stopped reading the scripts that they sent over because I thought, that's just going to annoy me. Anyway, last week I discovered that Jack is now a girl again, which makes me very happy because that's the central dynamic of the story. But when I go over there and meet them, I will be very nervous and wondering how Cornwall becomes Perth and hope that they get it right. So yes, I'll be a quivering wreck, probably. Is the ultimate answer to your question.
Thank you. There, sir? Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, we'll go there. Let's go there, and then we'll go there. Sorry. Yeah.
Me?
Yes, go ahead.
Hello, Simon.
That's a madam, not a sir.
No, I know, but I was pointing at the gentleman here who was clearly a sir. And then as I was pointing behind the thing. Well, just to be clear, there wasn't for one moment that I thought that I was... I know my eyesight's bad. It's not that bad. Madam.
Hi, Simon. With the benefit of hindsight, what advice would you offer to any young writers that we might have amongst us tonight?
If I can do it, then anyone can do it. I would feel ill-equipped, really, to answer. I mean, this is my 5th book. I feel as though I'm at the very beginning. I'm aware that, as my editor often points out, my spelling and grammar leave something to be desired. But actually, that can be corrected. And it's the heart of the story and the characters which are everything. And if you find a story that's compelling enough and you can make your characters believable in telling that story, then it's going to work off the page. There is no correct way of writing a story. I've interviewed authors who plan everything meticulously. They'll know what happens in chapter 6. They'll know what happens in chapter 10. They'll know how it's going to finish. If you talk to people like Ian Rankin, one of our most successful authors, when he starts writing one of his novels, one of his rebus novels, he doesn't, it starts with a murder, he doesn't know who the murderer is. I find that astonishing. When J.K. Rowling plots a book, she plots meticulously. She knows everything all the way through. So there isn't a right way, there isn't a wrong way. The only, as I've already mentioned, the Stephen King book on writing was for me such a revelation because it made me think that I could do it. And it gives a series of ideas, and some things will work for you and some things won't work for you. He suggests 1,000 words a day, 6 days a week. He suggests writing with the door shut and rewriting with the door open in terms of a headspace. Anyway, there's all kinds of ideas in there. So passing on advice is tricky, and in the end you fall back on the old adage of reading. The more you read, the more input that comes in, the more material you have to maybe come up with something that the output is going to have some spark of originality. Because if you don't read, you don't stand a chance, basically. Does that work as an answer? Okay.
Gentleman there.
Are you sure?
I am sure, yeah.
And
sorry,
that's my question. Just wanted to say, it's not working.
Hang on, we'll just run the other microphone round to you just because I'm just conscious of people online not being able to hear otherwise. It's just coming down this way.
That's better.
Hello.
Before I ask my question, I just wanted to say the end of a working week is always welcome, but hearing you guys on the radio makes it particularly welcome, and thank you for that.
Well, thank you very much.
Please keep listening and keep us employed.
Sadly, I do have some knowledge of the 1812 war, which is, for instance, naval gunfire heard of for Britain when the Americans and the Royal Navy were fighting each other is often forgotten, but it's a historical fact. But what I do know is that typically the height between the decks on the ships of those days were little more than about 5 feet, so King Dick must have had a permanent headache if he was 6'7". I would just
Yes.
wondered what you felt about that.
Oh, well, he was captured on a... So the US Navy at the time was very, very small. So most of the ships that fought the British were privateers. And he was caught on a ship called the Requin, or it's an American ship, which is, they'd probably say Requin, anyway, it's the French for shark. I haven't looked at the details of that particular ship. But if you're 6'7" and the average sailor is going to be 5'6", something like that, you can guarantee that he would have struggled enormously. But he was such. We know nothing about him until Dartmoor. So the rest of it. So it's kind of like open season. We can make up what we want for him. I imagine that he was a free man. That was his history. But we don't know that. But he took, what we do know is that he took over prison force so quickly that whatever the cramped conditions that he had, my guess is he had the best berth. My guess is that he made sure that the conditions were as immaculate as they could have been because he was in charge. And if you disagreed, he had a club, which would be on his side of the argument. But yeah, it's a good point. And I'm going to go back and see if I can find what the plans for the Requin were, and then I can answer your question properly.
And it is true about the bearskin hat, isn't it? You didn't make that up. That is true.
Everything about that. I think if I had made up a character who was 6'7", who ran prison for, and had the bearskin and the club and the 2 white boys, I think you'd have gone, excuse me? I don't. The editor would have sent a little note saying, can we tone this down a little bit? And in fact, getting notes from the editor is just like handing in an essay here and at school, except that there are, the red goes on for a long time.
Yeah, so we have a few now. So we'll go just immediately there, and then a couple of rows back, and then over to the gentleman there.
Okay, this is a question really for both of you. I wonder about the difference between critical thinking and creative thinking and writing. I wonder whether you, Simon, have to suppress your inner Kermode when you're thinking creatively, and whether that's also true of Mark when he's thinking critically. He has to suppress his inner Mayo.
What an extraordinary thought.
Yes. That's an image I'm not going to get out of my mind for a long time.
That's a very intriguing question. I guess I had so much to worry about in telling the story that I suppose obviously you do have a critical sense, and when you read and then reread, and then you realize that you've made mistakes, and you realize that that needs to be altered. All the time you have that critical eye, and then if you have the luxury of being able to leave it for a month and then come back and then you read the thing again, you go, what was I thinking? No, that absolutely doesn't work. And that's like the opposite of what I've just written. So I think you cannot lose the critical eye at any stage. But mainly it's the creative. I couldn't be a critic, but I can, as everyone in this room, you criticize yourself. You're a good critic of your own work, and you look at that and you go, is that good enough? Is that good enough? Is that sentence right? Would he really have spoken like that? Would she really have worn that? Is that scene believable? So that is a permanent process. What about you?
Because the stuff I write is different. I don't write fiction. The way I tend to do it is I write everything in a splurge, then I read it back, and I do read it back sometimes thinking, if I were a critic, I would kick the crap out of this, but is it funny? And actually, with most of what I've written, the key thing has been, is it funny? Does it make me laugh? And because I think if something makes me laugh, then I'll forgive it all the things that are wrong with it. But I remember William Peter Blatty, who wrote The Exorcist, saying that when he wrote Exorcist 3, he wrote the script and he wrote the screenplay and he thought it was the best thing he'd ever written.
Almost at the end of the evening, and
Thank
now
you, thank you. And then he ended up directing it, and he said he got on set and he opened it and he thought this was written by an idiot, because once you were directing it, it became a completely different thing. But so that's it. For me, it's whether it makes me. For you, it's whether it's truthful and honest, and for me, it's is it funny? Yeah. Which in so many ways is the core of the way our relationship is.
It wasn't the main thing that I needed.
No, exactly.
Although there are some jokes in it.
Yeah, there are. 2 rows behind, there was a hand up, and then we'll go to the gentleman over there.
Hi, Simon. Hi, Mark. Simon, you're lucky enough to be surrounded by lots of amazing, talented, creative and artistic people. When you're writing, did you keep it a really personal process to get your thoughts down, or did you ever want to discuss and get the input of other people on this, and how do you sort of balance that, or was it just a private thing?
It's an interesting question. I mean, radio is a very kind of collaborative process, so so the contrast between this and writing has been quite stark, because obviously it's a very lonely job by its very nature. I think what I relied on was, the answer to the question is, I didn't really discuss it very much at all, apart from with my editor, because if I'm going to do a radio interview, most of the work is done before you actually do the interview. So if you thought in detail about what you're going to say and what the other person might say and how it's going to go, that will make the whole editing process a lot easier. So when I was setting off writing this story, I had a very, very long and detailed conversations with the editor to make sure that we were on the same page, that he wanted me to write the same book that I wanted myself to write. And then he made some very interesting and acute observations. So, for example, he said at the early stage, he said, "I think it's a bit nice." And I think that was because I'd been writing children's and YA, not that, I mean, some of those are pretty grimy, but, and looking back, I think, okay, yes, probably. And so work was done to make it less nice. He also wanted me to bring forward, I mentioned Elizabeth Shortland, who's the wife of the agent. Elizabeth Shortland was a background character and is now one of the most important characters in the story, and she's one of the main point of view characters. So there are 3 POV characters. One is Joe, the 16-year-old, one is Habs, the 17-year-old, and the other is Elizabeth Shortland, who is married to the agent. So she gives us a completely different perspective, and it was inspired editing, basically. So I guess what I'm saying is it was all me, but that is me with the editor, who was able to very successfully, I mean, Bill Scott Carr is one of the best editors around. He could look at what I'd done and pull out that and go less of that, and so it was collaborative from that point of view.
It is worth adding, just very briefly, you and I did write a book together, and actually the way that worked was Jenny Lord, our editor, was the person who pulled it all together. Because although we're credited with writing it, it was literally Jenny standing in the middle of it all, doing air traffic control, that made that book make any sense at all.
And the work of the editor is, the worst moment in this whole process is the editor's letter. So you've worked on the thing for a year, year and a half, whatever, and then you get 2 or 3 pages. This is the beginning of the editing process, and it starts with all the positive stuff. Well done. It's really good. You must be so proud. Yeah. However, and then it'll say things like, lose this character completely. That bit after page 56, that doesn't work. And then you go, oh, and by the time you've finished, you're thinking, oh, it's a disaster. The whole thing's a catastrophe. But you have to trust the editor, and if your relationship is a good one, then you're going to be fine.
Yeah. There was a question over here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, thank you for coming here tonight.
Thank you.
So yeah,
Thanks very much.
It's a treat.
Nice shirt.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, when we finish this little love-in, can we get to the...
Well, the question is, you mentioned that you went to Dartmoor Prison.
Yes.
Did going there change the vision of the story in your mind's eye? Did it kind of make you feel differently about it?
I wanted to go to Dartmoor Prison while I was writing the book, but I only went there after I'd finished writing the book. It is a working prison. It's a Category 3 prison. What you can do is walk around it. You can visit the museum. It's the only British prison which has a museum. So you get a flavour. You can see enough. It's still a terrifying, genuinely terrifying building. I wanted to go in before, but the processes of applying to go in, nothing worked fast enough. I think if I had been admitted and gone in, it wouldn't have changed a thing, because I'm working from maps of the prison from 1814, 1815. It's a very, very different prison. Inside, for example, it's warm. Inside, they have food. Inside, they're quite healthy. So it wouldn't have helped as a picture. But outside, if many of you will have driven past it, and seen it, it's that terrifying. Imagine what that, it doesn't look as though it's changed since 1807, even though it has just a bit. So seeing it from the outside was all I needed, really.
Simon, I'm aware that it's just gone past 7:10, and in my radio...
The night is yet young.
I know the night is yet young. We could probably carry on for another hour or so, but I am also aware that we're meant to finish theoretically around about 7:10. So I think that was actually a very nice note to finish on.
I think
Will,
that lady there had a great question.
Do you want? No, okay. Do you want to take one more?
Can we take?
Okay, I've been overruled.
She looked very disappointed.
There we go.
She just looked very disappointed when you said last question.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks. So suddenly it's good cop, bad cop. You're the good cop, I'm the bad cop. That's how it's always worked. It's fine. I've got used to it. And yet, funnily enough, people come up to me in the street and they say, I like you, not him. So it's just weird. I don't know how it works.
Often the last question is often the very, very best question.
Oh, I don't think so.
Yeah, no pressure.
I wanted to say, as someone who struggles to get up by 9 o'clock every morning, do you need to be a lark to be a writer? Do you need to be an early person?
No. No, you absolutely don't. That's just what works for me. If you want to write from midnight till 4, whatever is right for you. I mean, genuinely, that's why I said there is no correct way to write a novel. So if your most creative time is between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, or between 3 and 4 in the morning, whatever works for you. So I think being up with the lark is a curse sometimes. It just happens to work for me. So no, there are no rules.
You were right. That was a nice question to end on.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking the fabulous Simon Mayo.
Well. And Mark Kermode.
That's Professor Mark Kermode.
Professor Mark Kermode, I forgot.
Yeah.
Professor Mark.
Okay, given that the questions could probably have gone on for a lot longer, I feel like the most unpopular person in the room right now, but it does fall to me the very pleasurable task of giving the vote of thanks. I will keep it brief, though, because I know that some of you want to take up the opportunity for the book signing with Simon, and we have until 7:45, so we want to leave as much time as possible for that, and that will take place in here. And I'll say just one more word about that at the end. Before I do the important thanks that we need to make. Firstly, thank you so much to Simon and to Professor Mark for...
Can I be doctor then?
Well, yeah.
Honorary doctor.
Honorary professor, come on.
Yeah.
Why aren't you in robes anyway?
Well, because I didn't want to massively overshadow you with my academic prowess.
Sorry, carry on with the vote of thanks.
Yeah, that's okay. No robes, okay, no hat. Thank you for coming. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And thank you for a really fantastic creative dialogue. It's been really... I hope you've enjoyed the role reversal, first of all, as much as everyone else here has, I think. And thank you for the insights that you've offered in terms of your approach to the creative process. And I think for some of the aspiring writers in the room, some quite, inspirational words in terms of making the writing happen for you. Beyond the thanks to both of you for participating this evening, there is other people who we need to thank because these events wouldn't happen without them. I need to thank the College of Humanities and also the Provost and her office for the support they show for these events. This season has been running for about a year now, or coming up for a year, and it couldn't happen without that support, so we are tremendously grateful. I'd also like to thank all of the people in events management, the team with Margaret House-Hayes, who I know doesn't want me to thank her, but I think she needs thanking for putting on this event, the technicians who are here, and those from the Dean's Office who've worked really hard to make this event the success that it is, and to allow so many of you to have enjoyed the conversation this evening. So thank you very much to all of those people who make this possible. Finally, thank you to you for coming. It's really fantastic for us to see so many people here, and to see a range of students and staff and people I know from beyond the university here, because this is what we want these events to be about, really, the university also engaging with the wider community. As I said, I will keep this brief, so thank you once again, Simon, thank you, Mark. If we could show our appreciation one more time, and also to say there will be a signing in here. If you haven't got a book and you want to purchase a book, there are some books still available outside. Please, could you form an orderly queue? We have a tight time schedule, so we have half an hour for the signing. So
it might not be anybody.
That's what you said before we came in here. Oh, there might not be anyone in here. So there may well be some people who want to sign, but please make sure that everyone has a chance to speak to Simon who wants to, and to get their books signed. So thank you once again, and could we just show our appreciation again for all of that?
I didn't ask you to do a reading, but it just...